The wooden chair in the makeshift American interrogation tent creaked as Obergefreiter Hans Richter shifted his weight, trying to ease the pain from the shrapnel wound in his left shoulder that had led to his capture 3 days earlier near the Rhine River. The 24-year-old Wehrmacht soldier from Munich had been expecting this moment, the final interrogation before execution, since American paratroopers had found him bleeding in a bombed farmhouse on March 27, 1945. Hans stared at his hands, still bound with rope despite his obvious inability to pose any threat to his captors. The uniform he wore, field grey wool marked with the eagle and swastika of the German army, was torn and stained with blood, mud, and the desperation of Germany's final collapse. He had resigned himself to death, as so many German soldiers had during these last weeks of hopeless fighting. "The general wants to see you," announced Staff Sergeant William Thompson, entering the tent with an expression that Hans couldn't read. The American NCO had been professional but distant during the past 3 days, following military protocol for handling enemy prisoners without displaying either cruelty or unnecessary kindness. Hans nodded slowly, understanding that his brief captivity was about to end. American propaganda had portrayed German generals as war criminals deserving of summary execution, while German propaganda had painted American commanders as brutal executioners who showed no mercy to captured enemy personnel. Either way, a personal summons from a general suggested that his case had attracted high-level attention for reasons that probably meant death. "Verstehen, do you understand English?" Sergeant Thompson asked, speaking slowly in the mixture of German and English that had characterized their limited conversations over the past days. "Yes, some," Hans replied quietly, using the English he had learned during better times when his father had operated a small export business in Munich. "I understand. Enough." The admission that he spoke English might have been a mistake, Hans realized. Multilingual prisoners were often suspected of being intelligence operatives or special forces personnel, categories that received harsher treatment than ordinary infantry soldiers. But honesty seemed pointless when death appeared inevitable. As Thompson escorted him across the muddy compound toward the large command tent, where American flags indicated the presence of senior officers, Hans reflected on the series of events that had led to this moment. His capture had been almost accidental. He had been trying to reach German lines after his unit disintegrated during the American crossing of the Rhine, when infection from his untreated wound had left him delirious and unable to continue. The American soldiers who found him had provided immediate medical attention, cleaning his wound and giving him sulfur powder that probably saved his life. Their treatment had been correct but impersonal, following Geneva Convention requirements, without displaying the brutality that German propaganda had led him to expect from enemy forces. "General Morrison will see you now," Thompson announced as they approached the command tent. "Remember, you will stand at attention until given permission to be at ease. Address him as Sir or General. Answer all questions honestly." Hans took a deep breath, trying to prepare himself for whatever was coming. Through the tent's open flap, he could see maps of Germany covered with colored pins showing American advances, radio equipment crackling with military communications, and several officers in clean uniforms that contrasted sharply with his own bedraggled appearance. "Bring the German prisoner," shouted a voice from inside the tent, a command delivered with the authority of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. The words were spoken in English, but their meaning was unmistakable even to someone with limited language skills. "This is the end," Hans thought as Sergeant Thompson guided him through the tent entrance. "They are going to execute me in front of the general staff as an example to other German prisoners." The interior of the command tent was larger and more elaborate than Hans had expected, fitted with folding tables, communication equipment, and detailed maps that revealed the scope of American military operations across Germany. 6 or 7 officers were present, their ranks indicated by insignia that Hans recognized from intelligence briefings about enemy military organization. Brigadier General Robert Morrison stood behind a map table, his steel gray hair and weathered face reflecting years of military command that had brought him from the beaches of Normandy to the heart of Germany. At 53, Morrison was a career officer who had seen enough of warfare to understand both its necessities and its moral complexities. "Stand here," Thompson directed, positioning Hans at attention in front of the general's table. The formality of the moment seemed to confirm Hans's expectations about military justice being administered in accordance with proper procedures. General Morrison studied Hans for a long moment, his expression unreadable as he evaluated the young German soldier who stood before him. Hans forced himself to maintain military bearing despite his exhaustion and fear, unwilling to display weakness in what he assumed would be his final moments as a soldier. Obergefreiter Hans Richter, 116th Panzer Division, Morrison said, reading from a folder that obviously contained intelligence gathered during Hans's interrogation. 24 years old, from Munich, drafted in 1943, served on the Eastern Front, then transferred to Western defenses. The recitation of his military record was both accurate and ominous, suggesting that American intelligence had thoroughly investigated his background and service history. Hans wondered if they had discovered something about his unit's activities that warranted special attention from senior command. "Yes, sir," Hans replied, using the English honorific that Thompson had instructed him to employ. His voice sounded steadier than he felt, though his heart was racing with anticipation of whatever verdict General Morrison was about to deliver. Morrison continued to study the intelligence folder, occasionally glancing up at Hans with an expression that seemed more curious than hostile. The silence stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, creating psychological pressure that Hans struggled to endure. "Tell me about your family," Morrison said suddenly, asking a question that Hans had not anticipated and could not understand in the context of military justice proceedings. "Sir?" Hans replied, uncertain whether he had understood the English correctly or why an American general would be interested in his personal background rather than his military service. "Your family," Morrison repeated patiently. "Parents, siblings, what they do for work. I want to understand who you are beyond this uniform." The request was so unexpected that Hans wondered if it might be some form of psychological interrogation designed to extract information through seemingly casual conversation, but the general's tone suggested genuine interest rather than tactical manipulation. "My father owns small business," Hans said carefully, using his limited English vocabulary to describe his family situation. "Import and export before the war. My mother teaches school. I have younger sister, was studying to be nurse." Morrison nodded, making notes in the margin of Hans's file. "And you, what did you do before you were drafted?" "I was studying engineering at university," Hans replied, growing more confused about the purpose of these personal questions. "Mechanical engineering. I wanted to design machines, maybe work in my father's business." The conversation was taking a direction that Hans could not have imagined. Instead of facing charges or receiving sentence, he was discussing his educational background and career aspirations with an enemy general who seemed genuinely interested in his responses. Morrison closed the intelligence folder and looked directly at Hans, his expression serious but not threatening. "Obergefreiter Richter, I have some news that may surprise you." Hans braced himself for whatever revelation was coming, still expecting that his execution would be announced, despite the unexpected personal nature of their conversation. The general's words would determine whether his brief captivity ended in death or continued under different circumstances. The moment of truth had arrived, and Hans prepared to face whatever fate an American general had decided for a German prisoner whose only crime had been serving his country during the final collapse of the Third Reich. "Obergefreiter Richter," General Morrison continued, his voice carrying an authority that commanded attention, but without the harshness Hans had expected. "3 days ago, your actions near the Rhine River saved the lives of 4 American paratroopers. I want to understand exactly what happened during your encounter with Lieutenant Palmer's patrol." Hans stared at the general in complete bewilderment, trying to process words that seemed to make no sense in the context of his capture and interrogation. How could his actions have saved American lives when he had been desperately trying to escape American forces and reach German lines? "Sir," Hans replied hesitantly, "I do not understand. I was wounded, trying to reach my unit. I did not encounter American paratroopers until they captured me." Morrison exchanged glances with his staff officers before opening a different folder that contained what appeared to be American military reports rather than German intelligence files. Lieutenant David Palmer, 82nd Airborne Division, submitted a combat report describing an incident that occurred on March 27th at 14:30 hours near your capture location. The general began reading from the report, his voice taking on the formal tone of official military documentation. Quote, While pursuing retreating German forces, my patrol encountered an enemy minefield that had not been marked on our tactical maps. A wounded German soldier, later identified as Obergefreiter Hans Richter, called out warnings in English that prevented my men from entering the mined area. His warnings saved at least 4 American lives. End quote. Hans felt his legs weaken as memory flooded back. The moment when he had seen American soldiers approaching the concealed minefield that his own unit had laid 2 days earlier. In his fever-induced delirium from his infected wound, he had shouted warnings without thinking about the military implications of helping enemy forces. "I remember," Hans whispered, his voice barely audible as he recalled the incident that had seemed unimportant compared to his own desperate situation. "The mines. Your soldiers were walking into the minefield. I could not let them die like that." Morrison leaned forward, his expression showing genuine interest in understanding Hans's motivation for helping enemy soldiers. "Why did you warn them? You were trying to escape American forces. Warning our patrol compromised your own safety." The question forced Hans to confront his own actions and motivations during a moment when rational military thinking had been overwhelmed by basic human instincts. He struggled to find English words adequate to explain decisions that had been made without conscious calculation. "They were young men," Hans said slowly, searching for vocabulary to express complex emotions. "Like me, like my friends who died on the Eastern Front. War makes us enemies, but I could not watch them walk into death when I could prevent it." Colonel James Harrison, Morrison's chief of staff, had been listening to the conversation with growing interest in the moral complexity of combat situations that created unlikely alliances between enemies. "Did you understand that warning our patrol might lead to your own capture?" Hans nodded, remembering the calculation that had flickered through his fever-clouded mind as he shouted warnings to the approaching Americans. "Yes, but I was already too weak to escape, and I could not live with watching men die when I could save them." The admission revealed the moral framework that had motivated Hans's decision, a recognition that human life had value that transcended the artificial boundaries created by military conflict. His choice had prioritized humanitarian instincts over tactical advantage. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Bennett, the division's intelligence officer, consulted notes she had taken during previous interrogations with captured German personnel. "Obergefreiter Richter, your behavior is unusual among German prisoners we've encountered. Most are either hostile or completely withdrawn. You warned our patrol, you've been cooperative during questioning, and you show no signs of Nazi fanaticism." Hans considered his response carefully, understanding that his words might influence not only his own fate, but potentially the treatment of other German prisoners. "Colonel, I am a soldier, but I am also a human being. The Nazi Party does not represent all German people. The distinction between military service and political ideology was crucial for American officers who were trying to understand German society and plan for post-war reconstruction. Hans's attitudes suggested that significant numbers of German soldiers might be motivated by patriotism rather than Nazi fanaticism. General Morrison had been studying Hans's medical records, noting the severity of the wound that had led to his capture, and the excellent medical care he had received from American military physicians. "Our doctors say you would have died from infection within 24 hours if our medics hadn't treated your wound. How does that make you feel about American military medicine?" "Grateful," Hans replied immediately, touching his shoulder where American medical supplies had prevented gangrene and probably saved his life. "Your medics treated me better than some German medical personnel treat their own soldiers." The comparison revealed Hans's awareness of resource shortages and morale problems within German forces, information that was valuable for American intelligence, but also demonstrated his willingness to acknowledge superior American capabilities. Major William Rogers, the division's medical officer, had been responsible for Hans's treatment and had observed his recovery during 3 days of captivity. "General, this prisoner has been exemplary in his behavior. Polite, cooperative, grateful for medical care, and helpful in explaining German medical procedures to our staff." Morrison nodded, understanding that Hans's conduct during captivity provided evidence of character that extended beyond his decision to warn American soldiers about the minefield. "Obergefreiter Richter, I have a proposition for you." Hans straightened to attention, uncertain what kind of proposition an American general might offer to a German prisoner. but understanding that his response could determine his immediate future. "Yes, sir. Lieutenant Palmer's patrol is being awarded commendations for their successful mission, despite encountering unexpected hazards," Morrison explained. "Your warning prevented American casualties and contributed to their success. I believe such humanitarian actions deserve recognition." The concept of recognizing enemy actions that saved American lives was unprecedented in Hans's military experience, but it reflected American values that emphasized individual moral choices over collective guilt for warfare. "Sir," Hans said carefully, "I do not understand what recognition means for enemy prisoner." Morrison smiled for the first time during their conversation, his expression indicating that Hans's confusion was both expected and about to be resolved. "Obergefreiter Richter, the United States Army has procedures for recognizing exceptional conduct by enemy personnel. Your actions saved American lives at personal risk to yourself." The general paused, allowing the significance of his words to register before continuing with an announcement that would fundamentally change Hans's understanding of American military justice and his own immediate prospects. Instead of remaining in a prisoner of war camp for the duration of hostilities, you are being offered the opportunity to serve with American medical units as a translator and cultural advisor, with the understanding that such service would contribute to saving lives on both sides of this conflict. Hans stared at General Morrison in complete shock, unable to process an offer that transformed his expectation of execution into an opportunity for continued service in a humanitarian capacity. The proposal challenged every assumption he had formed about how enemies treated captured personnel. I do not understand," Hans stammered, his limited English vocabulary inadequate for expressing his amazement at this unexpected turn of events. General Morrison's expression remained serious but kind, as he prepared to explain an offer that would test Hans's commitment to the humanitarian principles he had demonstrated when he warned American soldiers about the minefield that could have killed them. "Let me explain exactly what we're offering," General Morrison said, gesturing for Hans to be seated in a chair that had been brought into the command tent. The invitation to sit during a formal military discussion was itself unprecedented in Hans's experience, suggesting that his status had fundamentally changed from prisoner to something approaching guest. "Our medical units are treating increasing numbers of German casualties as we advance deeper into your country," Morrison continued, consulting reports that detailed the humanitarian challenges of American military operations. "Many German wounded cannot communicate with our medical personnel, creating dangers for both patients and doctors." Colonel Harrison spread medical casualty reports across the map table, showing statistics that illustrated the scope of the problem American medical units faced when treating German prisoners and civilians. "Last week alone, we had 3 incidents where German patients died because our doctors couldn't understand their medical histories or current symptoms." Hans studied the reports, his engineering training allowing him to quickly comprehend the logistical and humanitarian implications of language barriers in medical treatment. The numbers represented not just statistics, but human lives that could be saved through better communication between patients and caregivers. "You would serve as translator and cultural advisor with the 34th Medical Battalion," Morrison explained, helping American medical personnel treat German casualties more effectively. "Your engineering background would also be valuable for understanding technical aspects of German medical equipment and procedures." The proposal was extraordinary in its scope and implications. Hans would be transitioning from enemy prisoner to active participant in American military operations, but in a humanitarian capacity that aligned with his decision to save American lives rather than watch them die in a minefield. Lieutenant Colonel Bennett consulted intelligence files that contained background information on Hans's family and education. "Your academic records show excellent performance in technical subjects, and your father's export business required foreign language skills that you apparently inherited. These qualifications make you uniquely valuable for medical translation duties." Hans felt overwhelmed by the detailed knowledge American intelligence had gathered about his background, but he was also impressed by their systematic approach to identifying personnel whose skills could serve humanitarian purposes. "My English is not perfect," he said carefully, "but I can learn medical vocabulary if taught properly. We have German-English medical dictionaries and training materials," Major Rogers assured him. "More importantly, You have demonstrated the moral character necessary for medical work. Saving enemy lives requires the same ethical foundation as saving friendly lives. The comment highlighted the fundamental principle that would govern Hans's potential service with American medical units, the recognition that medical ethics transcended national boundaries and required universal compassion for suffering human beings. General Morrison studied Hans's expression, evaluating his response to an offer that required not just linguistic skills, but moral commitment to serving former enemies with the same dedication he would show to German patients. This is not a decision to make lightly, Obergefreiter Richter. You would be working directly with American medical personnel, sharing their risks and responsibilities. Hans understood that accepting the offer would mark him as a collaborator in the eyes of German military authorities, potentially affecting his family's safety and his own future in post-war Germany. But the opportunity to save lives, both German and American, aligned with the humanitarian instincts that had motivated his warning about the minefield. "Sir," Hans said slowly, "if I accept this position, what happens to me after the war ends? Will I be considered traitor by German authorities?" Morrison exchanged glances with his staff officers, understanding that Hans's concern about post-war consequences was both legitimate and difficult to address, given the uncertain political situation in Germany. The war will end soon, and there will be significant changes in German government and society. People who helped save lives during the final period of conflict will likely be viewed more favorably than those who continued fighting hopeless battles. Colonel Harrison added practical considerations that might influence Hans's decision. American forces will be involved in German reconstruction for several years. Personnel who demonstrated cooperation and humanitarian values during the occupation period will have advantages in finding employment and rebuilding their lives. The promise of post-war assistance was valuable, but Hans understood that his decision needed to be based on moral principles rather than personal advantage. The American offer represented an opportunity to fulfill medical service that aligned with his values, regardless of political consequences. "May I ask questions about the medical work?" Hans inquired, wanting to understand the scope and nature of his potential responsibilities before making a commitment that would define his role for the remainder of the war. "Of course," Major Rogers replied, appreciating Hans's serious approach to understanding duties that would require both technical competence and emotional resilience. "You would work primarily in field hospitals and aid stations, translating for German patients who need emergency medical care." Rogers described the typical cases Hans would encounter: wounded German soldiers requiring surgery, German civilians injured in bombing raids, and displaced persons suffering from malnutrition and disease. Each category presented linguistic and cultural challenges that could affect patient outcomes. "German medical terminology differs from American practices," Rogers explained, "and German patients often have cultural expectations about medical treatment that our doctors don't understand. Your role would be bridging those gaps to ensure proper care." Hans nodded, recognizing that his service would involve not just translation, but cultural mediation that could significantly improve medical outcomes for German patients. His unique position as a German working with American medical personnel would create opportunities to save lives that might otherwise be lost to communication failures. "There is one additional aspect of this assignment," General Morrison said, his tone indicating that he was about to address the most challenging component of Hans's potential service. "You would occasionally be asked to help identify German medical personnel among prisoners and civilians who could assist with treating large numbers of casualties." The request implied that Hans would be helping to build networks of German medical professionals who could work with American forces, essentially recruiting other Germans for collaboration with occupying forces. The moral complexity was significant, but the humanitarian benefits were equally important. "You would be helping to create medical cooperation that could save hundreds of German lives," Morrison emphasized. "But I understand this places you in a difficult position regarding loyalty and trust." Hans considered the moral implications of helping to identify German medical personnel for American service, weighing potential accusations of collaboration against the lives that could be saved through improved medical cooperation. His decision would reflect his understanding of duty, honor, and humanitarian responsibility. "General Morrison," Hans said finally, his voice carrying conviction that reflected careful consideration of the offer's implications. "I warned your soldiers about the minefield because I could not watch men die when I could prevent it. If I can help save German lives by working with American medical personnel, I believe this is the right choice." Morrison smiled, recognizing that Hans's response demonstrated the moral consistency that had motivated his original decision to help American forces. "Very well, Obergefreiter Richter. You will be assigned to the 34th Medical Battalion, effective immediately. Your rank will be adjusted to reflect your new status as a civilian medical auxiliary." The transformation from German prisoner to American medical assistant was complete, but it represented the beginning of challenges and opportunities that would test Hans's commitment to humanitarian service under circumstances that neither side had anticipated when the war began. As Hans prepared to begin his new assignment, he understood that his choice to save enemy lives had led to an opportunity to save many more lives, proving that individual moral decisions could have consequences far beyond their immediate circumstances. 2 weeks after his unexpected assignment to the 34th Medical Battalion, Hans found himself working in a converted German school building that had been transformed into a field hospital treating casualties from both sides of the collapsing Western Front. The morning of April 12, 1945, brought news of President Roosevelt's death, but the medical work continued with urgent intensity as German resistance crumbled and civilian casualties mounted. "Hans, we need you in surgery room 2, called Captain Mary Sullivan, the chief nurse whose initial skepticism about working with a former enemy had evolved into professional respect and personal friendship. "We have a German civilian with multiple trauma injuries, and Dr. Peterson can't understand his medical history." Hans immediately dropped the medical supply inventory he had been translating and hurried to the surgical area, where a middle-aged German farmer lay unconscious on an operating table. His injuries, severe burns and shrapnel wounds from Allied artillery fire, required immediate surgical intervention, but his medical condition was complicated by what appeared to be a pre-existing heart condition. Hat ein schwaches Herz," Hans translated after quickly examining the patient's medical identification card, which German civilians were required to carry. "He has a weak heart. The card says he takes digitalis for irregular heartbeat." Dr. James Peterson, a surgeon from Minnesota who had initially been uncomfortable working with German medical assistants, now relied heavily on Hans's cultural and linguistic knowledge. That changes everything about anesthesia protocols. Without that information, we might have killed him trying to save him. The medical emergency illustrated exactly why Hans's translation services had proven invaluable during 2 weeks of intensive medical cooperation. Cultural understanding, combined with linguistic ability, had prevented numerous medical errors that could have cost German lives. As Dr. Peterson began surgery with anesthetic dosages adjusted for the patient's heart condition, Hans moved to the next bed, where a young German soldier was recovering from amputation surgery performed the previous day. The 19-year-old Wehrmacht private had lost his left leg to an American landmine, and his psychological adjustment was proving as challenging as his physical recovery. "Wie geht es dir heute, Kurt?" Hans asked gently, using the informal German that was appropriate for someone close to his own age. "How are you feeling today?" Kurt Brenner looked up at Hans with the confused expression of someone struggling to understand why a German soldier was working alongside American medical personnel. "Are you a prisoner too? Why are you helping them?" The question was one that Hans faced daily from German patients who couldn't comprehend his voluntary cooperation with American medical forces. His answers had evolved into explanations that emphasized medical ethics over political considerations. "I'm helping them because they're saving German lives," Hans replied simply. "These American doctors and nurses are treating you better than many German hospitals could manage, especially now that our medical supplies are almost gone." Kurt considered this response while examining the quality of his medical care, which included pain medication, proper wound dressing, and nutritional support that exceeded what German military medical units could provide during the final weeks of the war. "But they're our enemies," Kurt protested weakly, though his tone suggested uncertainty rather than conviction. "Aren't you betraying Germany by helping them?" Hans had wrestled with similar questions during his first days with the medical battalion, but his answer had been reinforced by witnessing the humanitarian outcomes of American medical care. "Kurt, look around this hospital. German and American wounded are treated in the same beds, by the same doctors, with the same medicines. Medical care doesn't recognize enemies, only patients who need healing. The philosophical conversation was interrupted by Sergeant First Class Robert Martinez, the medical battalion's senior NCO, who had become Hans's primary liaison with American military personnel. "Hans, we just received word that a German military hospital near Frankfurt is requesting assistance with a typhus outbreak. General Morrison wants your assessment of whether we can provide meaningful help." The request represented exactly the kind of humanitarian cooperation that Hans's position was designed to facilitate. German medical authorities were acknowledging American superior resources and requesting assistance that could save hundreds of lives. But such cooperation required careful negotiation to ensure effective coordination. "Typhus requires specific medications and isolation procedures," Hans explained, while reviewing the German request. "If their supplies are exhausted, many patients will die without American pharmaceutical assistance." Martinez nodded, understanding that Hans's medical knowledge combined with his cultural insights made him uniquely qualified to evaluate such requests. "What would you recommend in terms of personnel and supplies?" Hans considered the logistical challenges of providing medical assistance to German forces that were still technically enemy combatants, but his focus remained on humanitarian outcomes rather than political considerations. A small team with typhus vaccines, antibiotics, and isolation equipment could save most of their patients. The German medical staff are competent, they just lack resources. The recommendation reflected Hans's growing role as a bridge between German and American medical communities, facilitating cooperation that served humanitarian purposes while maintaining military security requirements. Captain Sullivan had been listening to the conversation while checking on patients in the recovery ward. "Hans has become our most valuable asset for understanding German medical needs and capabilities," she observed to Martinez. "His recommendations have improved patient outcomes dramatically." The professional recognition was meaningful for Hans, who had found in medical translation work a sense of purpose that transcended the political complexities of his situation. Saving lives provided moral clarity that made his collaboration with American forces feel like duty rather than betrayal. Dr. Peterson emerged from surgery with news that the German farmers' operation had been successful, but also with a broader observation about the medical cooperation he had witnessed over the past 2 weeks. "Hans, your work here has changed how I think about treating enemy casualties. These aren't German patients and American patients, they're just patients who need medical care." The comment reflected the transformation in American medical personnel's attitudes that had resulted from working closely with Hans and observing his dedication to universal medical ethics. Professional cooperation had created personal relationships that transcended national boundaries. As afternoon evolved into evening, Hans compiled his daily report for General Morrison, documenting the medical cases he had assisted with and the intelligence he had gathered about German medical conditions and capabilities. His reports had become valuable sources of information for American planning of humanitarian operations. Today's cases included 12 German military casualties, 8 German civilians, and ongoing consultation regarding the typhus outbreak near Frankfurt, Hans wrote in English, that had improved dramatically through constant use. "Recommend immediate approval of medical assistance to German hospital, as delaying treatment will result in preventable deaths." The recommendations carried weight with American command authorities, who had learned to trust Hans's professional judgment and humanitarian motivations. His unique position allowed him to advocate effectively for German medical needs while maintaining credibility with American decision-makers. Colonel Harrison arrived at the field hospital that evening to discuss broader policy questions about medical cooperation with German authorities as the war neared its end. Hans's insights had become crucial for planning post-war medical reconstruction and cooperation. "The German medical system is more organized and professional than our intelligence initially indicated," Hans reported during his briefing with Colonel Harrison. "Many German doctors and nurses have maintained high standards of patient care, despite severe resource shortages." The assessment would influence American occupation policies and reconstruction planning, demonstrating how Hans's work extended beyond immediate medical translation to broader strategic considerations. As Hans prepared to sleep in the small room he had been assigned near the medical battalion's headquarters, He reflected on the journey that had brought him from expecting execution as a prisoner of war to serving as a bridge between former enemies united in the goal of saving lives. The German prisoner who had thought, "This is the end," when summoned before an American general, had instead discovered that moral courage could create opportunities for continued service to humanitarian principles that transcended the artificial boundaries created by warfare. His decision to warn American soldiers about a minefield had led to an assignment that was saving German lives daily, proving that individual choices to preserve life could have consequences far beyond their immediate circumstances and create bonds of professional respect between former enemies. The war would end within weeks, but the relationships Hans had formed with American medical personnel and the lives he had helped save would represent lasting achievements that demonstrated the power of humanitarian cooperation to transcend even the bitterest conflicts when guided by shared commitment to preserving human dignity and alleviating suffering. If this remarkable story of unexpected redemption and humanitarian service inspired you, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us share these incredible stories that prove individual moral choices can transform enemies into allies. We're passionate about uncovering these forgotten moments where people chose to save lives across enemy lines, showing how simple acts of humanity can lead to extraordinary opportunities for continued service. These stories remind us that even in the darkest conflicts, recognizing our shared humanity can create paths to cooperation and healing. What moved you most about Hans's transformation from captured prisoner expecting death to medical translator saving lives? His split-second decision to warn enemy soldiers about the minefield, the American general's recognition of moral courage over military loyalty, or perhaps the way humanitarian work created bonds that transcended national boundaries. And here's something profound to consider. In our own lives, when we choose to help someone we're supposed to consider an enemy or other, what unexpected doors might that choice open? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We love hearing how these stories of moral courage inspire you and what lessons they might hold for choosing humanity over hatred in our own divided world today.